Okay, so you're going to start with some jelly roll strips, and those are 2.5-inch strips by 44 inches in this case, which is the length of the fabric on the bolt. And then I've just laid them out in a pattern that I want them to, so that they can look like a flag. So basically you can see that I have it folded here on the one side. That makes the pieces 22 inches in length, and then the 2.5 inches in height. And I just have them lined up for the red and white stripes, and then I have the blue folded twice. So you can see how that's folded twice and then laid out next to the other red and white. Next, you'll cut all of those in pieces because you're going to want to pretty much make one side, so one flag, I guess you could say, on the one side. And then you can see I cut the salvage edge off too, although you won't have to do that because you'll get rid of it when you sew it later. You can cut it off later. But you can see how I have the one piece and then the second piece, and that's going to make the two sides of the skirt. So you can see I have all the pieces laid out and together, and then on these blue ones I've cut them so it's really a fourth of the whole jelly roll strip, and then you can see I have the other side, which will be the other part of the skirt below it, which means over on this side the blue is on the other side. And we're actually going to sew each piece separate, but when you flip it, it'll be a mirror image of itself. Next, pin that lowest red piece to the white piece right above it, and you're going to pin it and you're going to sew along that long horizontal edge all the way down. So I'm using a piecing foot to do this, and it has a bit of a guide on the one side. It makes sure that I'm keeping it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm doing some back stitching at the beginning and end, but it probably is not necessarily because you're going to sew it on the sides as well. You'll then take your pieces and you'll press it with your iron, and be sure that you're pressing towards the side of the darker fabric, so in this case towards the red. Then you're just going to continue this process of piecing these long strips together. So take your two strips that are already sewn, put the white fabric against your next strip of red, pin that together and sew that. When you reach the blue pieces, you're actually going to pin your shorter strips together and sew them on the short end, and then you'll sew along the long end. So that looks like this, where it's sewn together, and then I have it pinned so that I'm ready to sew the long end. A note about when you're pinning this together is to make sure that you're lining that up at the center. Don't worry so much about the ends because these are all going to be cut away anyway, and you're going to lose that, but you want to make sure the center line is nice and straight. Now when you repeat with the second whole piece, you now have two pretty much identical pieces that you'll work with of fabric, and you're going to take them and put them right sides together, and we're going to line up the fabric for the stripes along the edges and pin that together so that we can sew that together. So when you're pinning this, just be sure that your fabric is lining up so that you have these nice consistent lines, and then pin that together. Now in my case, my edges are really wonky, so I went ahead and drew a straight line on here with a disappearing ink pen so that I could see what my straight line would be when I go to sew this. And then I can just trim off the excess. Then stitch along your line. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once you've stitched it, you can just press open your seam allowances with your hot iron. Just kind of set the stitching. Then you'll want to finish the seam allowances in whichever method you do, and I'm lazy, so I usually use pinking shears to finish mine. Now we're going to roll the hem, and to do that, do about 1/8 of an inch fold. Use your iron to press, and then roll it again about 1/4 of an inch and press again. Take that over to your sewing machine and be sure to backstitch at the beginning and end and do about 1/8 inch seam allowance. That's what this looks like with 1/8 of an inch. I did a coordinated thread. Be sure to leave some tails on your thread here, so just pull those out so that you have probably 6 inches or so. And then stitch at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure that you're using a basting stitch so that it's nice and wide. You're going to stitch that along here, and then you're going to add a 5/8 inch seam allowance basting stitch all the way around the skirt. When you're done, pull off your machine and pull the thread tails and then cut it. Now the skirt's ready for the t-shirt. So on your t-shirt, check it against your kiddo and decide how far down you want your skirt to go. And then I wanted to make sure I found the center, so I'm measuring this out and marking where the center is at so that the center of my skirt will line up with the center of my shirt. And do that for the front and the back. To make the gathers, pull on your bobbin threads and push the fabric along. And then that'll bunch together and you can just kind of spread that out. Now you'll line it up with your shirt, so put the 2 edges and pin it, and then mark your center back and center front and pin that as well. Sometimes when I pin these, I just kind of lift up the shirt and pin it along there because that's really how it's going to sit on the kid anyway. So just kind of lift it up and put your pins in there, and then you're getting it more aligned with the top of the shirt. Now do a straight stitch, and between the 3/8 inch and 5/8 inch basting stitches that you have, so it should fall right between the two. And you're doing it at 1/2 inch, but you can see my fabric goes too far underneath for my t-shirt. So just kind of pay attention to make sure that you're between the basting stitches. Then use a seam ripper to just pop out all of those basting stitches and remove those. And you have a finished dress. So at this point in time, you can just kind of press your iron down and set those stitches, and you could be done. Or you could decide to add a ribbon or a sash or something for the waist. So I'm making a sash by putting 2 of the jelly roll strips together, right sides together. If you have a larger kid, you probably want to do 2 jelly roll strips and put the short ends and sew those together first, and then do the 2 longer strips together. So on the corners, I'm just going to do them on an angle, and then stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, except for about a 6 inch gap so that you have a way to turn them so the fabrics are right sides out. Once I finish that, clip that corner down and trim the seam allowance here, and then flip it inside out. And you have a finished sash, and you're ready to place it on your dress.